for coming along, and thanks everybody for being interested in learning a bit more about inflammation and how you can help your patients address low-grade and chronic inflammation. It's become quite a conversation in my clinic and in science. It is not a new idea that inflammation is at the root cause of disease. It can be dated back to the 70s and 80s, and that's with the broad sweeping introduction and use of plastics and petrochemicals and pesticides. And more modern research has emphasized the concern, especially over glyphosate, BPAs, heavy metals, poor water purification. The state of our water in the US is a shambles. But also some molds, we're looking at Stachybotrys, Aspergillus, how about parabens? We're also exposed to energetic stressors like UV light, non-ionizing radiation from microwaves, and those are just the chemical stressors that we are inhaling, ingesting, and absorbing into our skin. And when we look at environmental stressors as a term, you could look at it as either chemical or biological, and we're trying to figure out how our body is coping with stress because it's not coping very well with the toxins that it is being exposed to. And we want to add to this the oxidative stress related to metabolic imbalance, work, kids, traffic, global pandemics, for example. So everything that I've just discussed is considered a direct inducer of inflammatory responses within the body. And daily exposure to these continues to signal to our body that inflammation is required to deal with these stressors. But environmental stressors are ahead of our biological evolution. So we're kind of playing catch up on this, and that's creating a state of sustained inflammation within our body. And it's here within this chronic slow burn that botanicals and mushrooms have a huge potential, and I'm really excited about that. As Joni mentioned, I am so passionate about it, and I'm starting my deep dive into how phytochemicals can address inflammation in January. So I'm looking forward to sharing what I'm learning along the way. So why address inflammation first? Well, I opened my virtual healthcare clinic during a pandemic, and I eventually started specializing in just addressing inflammatory conditions because what I was seeing was 8 out of 10 patients were presenting with high inflammatory pathology markers. They may have other additional lab things going on, poor liver function, low iron, for example. But what I was finding was that by addressing the inflammation first, I was getting improved response to treatment. I was getting a reduction of the presenting symptoms, especially cognitive ones, and I was getting a reduced response time. There are 3 causes or known causes of inflammation, and the first 2, injury and trauma, and infection and allergens, are pretty well understood. Injury and trauma would be related to tissue driven, so a break or a sprain, for example. Infection and allergen is pretty self-explanatory, a pathogen or an allergen. And depending on the trigger, the inflammatory response has a different physiological purpose and outcome. So of all of these triggers, it's only the infection and allergen that has both an immune response and an inflammatory response, but the others are independent. And it's the environment that is having the most significant impact on chronic inflammation and the development of modern diseases based on the ability to alter our tissue homeostasis. Of all the triggers, the environmental stuff have become sort of a modern phenomenon because here is where a lot of what we know about inflammation is really poorly understood. But what we do know is that is a key driver. When we're understanding inflammation, the inflammatory response is coordinated by a large myriad of biological mechanisms managed by various pathways, but there is a rule of thumb. Most generalized inflammatory pathways consist of these 4 elements. You have the inducers, and these inducers trigger a production of numerous inflammatory pathways through communicating with the sensors. Examples of an endogenous inducer might be like an allergen or a chemical, and an exogenous, an endogenous example might be, say, the byproduct of collagen synthesis or cellular metabolism interacting with like a redox reaction. So you're communicating, the inducers communicate through sensors to the mediators. Now, we have 7 groups of mediators based on their biological properties. And they all have different functions, of course. Some mediators are actually preformed within mast cells and platelets. Some of them are floating around our plasma, ready to create an inflammatory response, like histamine or serotonin. That's pretty spontaneous, right? We can have an instantaneous response. But when we're looking at mediators, I'll take a lipid mediator, for example. One would be phosphatidylcholine, because I work with that quite a lot, so I'll stay where I'm comfortable. But the role of phosphatidylcholine its role is to enhance the passage of food and energy into a cell. And then it escorts out the trash, basically, the waste and the debris out of the cell. But it is known to be reduced in people who will say leaky gut syndrome or gut barrier perforation or poor permeability. These lipid mediators are also reduced or not acting effectively in people with Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, SIBO, especially severe SIBO. So I also, when I'm treating somebody with severe gastrointestinal upset like that, I will start with what I call like a gastrointestinal triage, especially with ulcerative colitis. I might start with phosphatidylcholine, and then I alternate it with, I put a beautiful powder of, say, slippery elm, tremula, and I use turkey tail within that, and I encapsulate it, and then I'll alternate. So when I say a triage, when somebody comes in, they are not absorbing anything, they are not tolerating anything. So I'll do phosphatidylcholine, and then I'll do these capsules, and I'll alternate that throughout the day. And I might do that through several weeks. And what I find is it tones all of that inflammation down and just makes it less angry. And that's where I start. And then I can come in with more systemic inflammation. But what I find is by toning a lot of that preliminary inflammation down, then you get a reduction in symptoms. When you are thinking of inflammation on a scale, we want to think about it on this long scale. When you actually have an inflammatory response, it's actually considered a severe circumstance. So if we have a break, for example, all of the inflammation goes, the end game is to immobilize that limb to protect the host. It's the same with, say, hay fever. That's another great example of a severe circumstance or an actual inflammatory response. There's an end game. There's something that we need to do. We want to isolate that, that allergen so that the body can attack it and remove it, right? And then we have our effectors. So the mediators are basically the sort of generals that tell everybody what to do, and the effectors are the tissues and cells that actually make things happen. Now, what's important is the effects of extensive malfunction or injury are those of the classic inflammatory response, one that has an end game, like I was suggesting. But unlike the signals that report infection and injury, the signals that report stress and poor function, say from environmental toxins, aren't as well understood. And here is where our modern diseases are starting to come up, especially mood disorders and things like that. So this is where we have some space. And this is a great slide to sort of give a direct indication of like what that looks like in the body. So a really healthy inflammatory response would be, or a successful acute inflammatory response results in the elimination of infectious agent with a repair phase. So if you have a look at the top line of this slide, we've got infection, then we have inflammation, and then the host cell defense against infection. That's our physiological purpose. In relation to tissue injury, we produce inflammation and we have tissue repair and response. As it relates to, say, just a tissue stress or a malfunction, we have an adaptive process, a restoration and homeostatic state. This is all a healthy outcome, okay? But within the inflammatory pathways, sometimes things go wrong. So within the infectious phase, we have an immune-driven inflammatory response, something that might be autoimmune, for example. Now, if that's the case, we get like a looping of inflammatory markers. And then what happens then, if you look at the left side of that slide, that host defense starts to produce more inflammation, and then you might have autoimmunity or an inflammatory tissue damage or sepsis, for example. But what about the case of tissue injury? What about if that localized infection was unsuccessful? You might get fibrosis or tumor growth. But in this third mechanism, we need to understand something that happens within a cell. Within all of the inflammatory pathways, there's this called like a homeostatic control mechanism, almost like a thermostat in your house. And within the cell, we have like this thermostat, and the role of it is to ensure an internal parameters are set. So we want glucose, we want oxygen concentrations, and we want them at this level to keep optimal homeostasis, right? Ideal range. But what happened is in this third column here, if we just continue and continue to get all of this environmental stress, our body doesn't know what to do with it. So it changes within the cell, that thermostat, where it goes, oh, okay, I guess we'll take more stress. I guess we can handle more of it. I guess, you know, we can do more and more and more and more and more. And what happens is there is a pathological consequence for that. And that's where we're seeing all of these new diseases form, because our body is trying to play catch up with these toxins, and we're not doing a great job of it. Because the world is evolving too quickly, I think, for our old DNA to catch up with, right? So acute and chronic inflammation are just adaptive responses, we know that, that come into play when cellular homeostasis mechanisms aren't functioning correctly. And we're trying to figure out why. So inflammation underscores a wide variety of physiological, pathological processes. And although the pathological aspects of inflammation are well appreciated and needed, such as like you break your leg or you have a pathogen, we're still trying to figure out the physiological mechanisms for all situations. Tissue stress or malfunction similarly induces an adaptive response, and it relies mainly on tissue resident macrophages. And we're going to work with the macrophages. That's how phytomedicine can get in, right? And lays between the basal homeostatic state and a classic inflammatory response. This response can be referred to as para-inflammation. I really like this term. It comes from the Greek meaning beside or near, and the term was coined by an immunology professor at Yale called Ruslan Medzatov. I read his paper about 6 months ago, and the origin and physiological roles of inflammation. I put the reference down the bottom of that slide for any geeks like me who really want to deep dive into inflammation. If you want to learn more about inflammation on a cellular level, it's an exceptional paper. But he states that parainflammation is probably responsible for the chronic inflammatory conditions that are associated with modern human disease. Let's have a look at what happens in a cell. So looking at that left cell, that's a basal cell, that's a happy cell. But basal cell's a happy cell. Everything's great in the basal cell, right? Opposing the basal cell, there's a damaged or infected cell. Okay, that's a state of inflammation caused by infection or tissue damage. But in the middle, where we have stressed or malfunctioning cells, is where parainflammation lives. And it can be categorized by an adaptive process by the cell, which helps the tissue respond to toxins and noxious conditions. So it's an adaptive response, and it has characteristics of both a healthy, happy cell, and it has characteristics of both a high inflammatory state. So that's where the para comes in. It sits near or in between that. Now, if this parainflammation isn't regulated and becomes continually dysregulated, then researchers are theorizing that this state is what may be driving modern chronic conditions today, especially metabolic conditions like type 2 diabetes and a lot of the complex mood disorders. Now, understanding chronic inflammation, we've identified 4 key drivers of chronic inflammation. One is dysbiosis, environmental toxins, infection and pathogens, and metabolic imbalances. Now, in relation to an infection and inflammation, pathogenic infections initiate an innate response where the leukocyte production and activation in cells. That's a normal, healthy, happy response. But what if that leukocyte immune response fails? What happens is that when we get this looping, it requires newly recruited and activated leukocytes to resolve infection or blood or tissues. Now, in this state, when we've got an acute infection and we need to hit it really hard, we're going to be looking at using anti-infective botanicals like Echinacea angustifolia, andrographis, garlic, of course, and Japanese knotweed. Now, Japanese knotweed is a beautiful antiviral. I love that herb. Now, clinical inflammation may, it's kind of a hoot because it may alleviate, it may aggravate the disease, but it may have no impact on the disease whatsoever. It may alleviate and aggravate at different time points, depending on the patient, and resulting in chronic inflammatory looping, an autoimmune driven inflammation. So when taking a case study of someone with autoimmune disease, I am always looking for the initial infection way back when. So somebody presents with lupus, for example, did they have measles as a kid? And then I'm looking for a secondary infection or a secondary trauma to the immune system or a key driver of inflammation. Did they have really bad shingles recently, for example? Did they have dysbiosis or a parasitic infection way back when, and then they've had this low grade inflammation, and then I'm looking for that secondary infection, because the secondary stress point, that's when genetics come into play and can cause immune dysregulation. So genetic immunological deficits in a single patient with specific vulnerability profile can reveal mechanisms of inflammation and disease that may be triggered by other causes. So for immune-driven inflammation, I'm looking to bupleurum, Bicol skullcap, Boswellia, astragalus, reishi, maitake, and turkey tail. And you will notice that I spell Bicol skullcap both ways, with a C and a K. All right, the big topic of environmental toxins. There's an estimated 80,000 new chemicals in our environment. That's plastic particles in our air, that's air pollutants. So diesel is a neurotoxin. Persistent organic pollutants, herbicides, fungal toxins, heavy metals, medications in our water supply. Many of these toxins cross the blood-brain barrier and also disrupt hormone balance. So BPA in plastic bottles is a known endocrine disruptor, and it may be linked to ADHD and asthma in kids. The World Health Organization has declared glyphosate a possible carcinogen, and some authors suggest that glyphosate is adding to the toxic burden of kids without a doubt. Autism, especially mood disorders, anxiety is rife within kids and teenagers right now. We're looking at persistent organic pollutants like biotoxins or PCBs or industrial runoff. Endocrine disruptors, this is a quote by Kerry Bone, who's a famous Australian herbalist. Endocrine disruptors are a modern problem leading to metabolic imbalances. New school of thought that increased incidence of type 2 diabetes is only partially lifestyle, but also due to environmental toxin exposure. Let's look at endocrine disruptors, because it's a relatively new problem and it's related to stress and environmental toxins. So research shows that the effects of psychological stress on the body's ability to regulate inflammation can promote the development and progression of disease. Chronically elevated cortisol alters the effectiveness of the hormone to regulate inflammation because it is an immune regulator. Runaway inflammation is thought to promote the development of the disease. This is not a new concept that people suffering stress are more susceptible to develop the common cold, and the symptoms are the expression of a virus, but the inflammatory response. And as a current toxin, we're only just getting our head around what conceptually stress is doing to our mind and our body. And recently, researchers have started to correlate chronic stress being associated with the body losing its ability to regulate the inflammatory response. Researchers out of Carnegie Mellon back in 2012 found that chronic elevated cortisol desensitizes the immune cell's reaction to its regulatory effects. And clinically, we see people with chronic elevated cortisol, it's driving up A1C, and so disrupts glucose control, and so associated with metabolic syndrome and precursor to metabolic diseases. Ensuring good cytoprotection. Oh, let's go back a little. I just wanted to talk about some of the herbs and botanicals that I really love for people who have had chronic elevated cortisol. Cordyceps, of course, licorice, rhodiola, and romania. That's the ones I typically use. Ensuring good cytoprotection and improving gut barriers and endothelial integrity are key. This is critically important in how to address stress in practice as it relates to inflammation. It's one of the most predominant presentations in clinic. Hands up, please. How many of you have patients that are like, I'm stressed? What's your stress level? It's through the roof. It's consistent. They might be presenting with difficulty sleeping, mood disorders, weight gain, digestive upset. And when you're addressing stress as the underlying cause, some or all of your patients presenting symptoms, research is directing us to see stress rather than an adrenal and a cognitive issue, but an inflammatory one. So for cytoprotection, improving gut barriers and endothelial integrity, we want to promote healthy NRF2 pathway function. I'm going to go into that pathway a little bit. And we want to increase those sweeping cells. So to remove the byproducts of both endogenous stressors and exogenous stressors. And I use green tea, shiitake, resveratrol, and grapeseed. Inflammation and major depressive disorder. We can't talk about inflammation without talking about the correlation between depression and the rise of anxiety in our society right now. The link between inflammation and depression has been supported by evidence that patients with MDD show elevated levels of inflammatory markers, and especially C-reactive protein for sure. Furthermore, studies have demonstrated that immune dysregulation and inflammation are associated with a range of psychiatric disorders beyond just major depressive disorder. We're looking at schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, autism, and PTSD. There was a 2019 cohort study that verified, this is actually pretty interesting, significant feature of PTSD was the presentation of inflammation, and researchers are arguing that it should be a consideration for both diagnostics and as part of the treatment protocol. And studies have identified immune and inflammatory related genes and pathways are the most dysregulated in patients with PTSD.
She said that. Huh? She said.
So addressing inflammation as part of mood disorders, in particular depression, may not only improve temporary mood, but also signify a decrease in progression of symptoms in some patients. Neuroprotective botanicals is key here, and so we want to improve microcirculatory nutrients that it can address both inflammation and mood. Lion's mane, bilberry, bioavailable curcumin, ginkgo biloba, garlic, beets, grapeseed, cocoa, yep, chocolate. Everybody knows chocolate's a great mood enhancer. And that's, of course, we're looking at dark chocolate, especially epicatechin-rich chocolate. Catechins are also in green tea, so that's a strong one as well. Turmeric, ginger, capsaicin-rich foods have all shown to support microcirculatory health, and we want proantho, cyanidin-rich berries as well. Dysbiosis, it's well known that gut microbiota modulates key pathological mechanisms, regulates motility, gut-brain axis, immune activation, and intestinal barrier function. The relationship between microbiota and chronic disease is well known. However, the impact of systemic inflammation may be the deciding factor here between whether the person actually develops a metabolic disease or not. People with IBD, IBS, DNC, SIBO, and SIFO are primary dysbiosis and interplay with low-grade inflammation. And we're not sure what came first, you know, what was the chicken or the egg scenario. Is what's exacerbating the symptoms a low-grade inflammation, or is that what developed the imbalance in the first place? Evidence for plant-forward approach to promote biodiversity. The study researching consumption of fried meat. There you go, Joni. That's your plant-forwardly vegetarian diets showed impaired glucose homeostasis and increased intestinal endotoxin systemic inflammation levels by influencing the gut microbiota. However, that's with frying meat. So you really want to have good quality meat and baking it or just using really good sense when cooking your meat. Studies comparing gut microbiota of IBS patients with healthy patients have failed to provide consistent comparisons, but there is some key findings. There's an increase in firmicutes and bacteroides ratio. We're definitely seeing a consistent decrease in lactobacillus and bifidobacteria populations, and an increase in strep and rheumacoccus. Strep is rife. I see that quite often. There's a huge role of mushrooms in microbiota, and so having them in capsule, in powder form, as well as eating them as much as you possibly can. The growth of lactobacilli and bifidobacteria is supported by beta-glucans, both in vivo and in vitro, and mushrooms have well-established prebiotic activity. Beta-glucans are digested and fermented by the intestinal flora, so it's speculated that their immune modulatory effects are due to the interactions with microbes. The immunomodulatory function of beta-glucans is often referred to as microbiota independent due to their ability to bind to immune cells directly. Shiitake, reishi, and maitake have all exhibited anti-tumor and cellular protective properties in the gut, but several studies report the exact action on microbiota is not yet confirmed. But of course, Skye and Lee and Mason may be able to clarify that for us if Mason was here. Yeah. Maitake has been connected to butyrate. Butyrate is a byproduct of that fermentation process in the gut. which has many protective properties, a regulator of mucosal gene expression and apoptosis. And there's a strong anti-inflammatory effect exerted by butyrate, and it occurs by impacting immune cells' expression of cytokines and inhibiting inflammatory cellular process actually happening within the gut. Joni, were you going to say something, man?
No, I'm just listening. I'm good.
If Mason was here, I'm sure he'd jump in. Lee's not here, huh? He good as
No, not tonight.
All right. That's cool.
Yeah.
So when we're looking at immune-driven inflammation and chronic inflammation, I'm looking at polyphenols always. They impact inflammatory pathways in multiple levels. Polysaccharides, not just beta-glucans, but all polysaccharides for the systemic impact on inflammation. I'm looking at bupleurum and rehmannia. They should be considered for Lyme's disease, actually, as a baseline therapy. Also kidney-related immune inflammation. Rehmannia works through the liver. It's a beautiful herb. Boswellia for systemic and autoimmune GIT and joints. Bioavailable curcumin as well as ashwagandha for the immunomodulatory impacts, improves phagocytosis. Echinacea purpurea is a well-known immune modulator and it helps tonify an immune response. Astragalus is for recovery. It's also used as a blood tonic for leukopenia, debility, poor function, and the elderly. Tissue-driven inflammation, I have a lot of fun here because herbs really have a huge role to play. So having a lot of fun might not be the best use of that, but I think you guys are all clinicians or natural therapists. I'm sure you get what I'm trying to say. Boswellia, I have a love-hate relationship with Boswellia. It is such a profoundly effective herb, but I tend to find in a percentage of my patients that it causes gastric upset. So the delivery mechanisms really matter when you're working with Boswellia. Clinical evidence supports its delivery in a lecithin suspension. I often tell my patients to have the Boswellia with their fattiest meal, but if I'm working with an ulcerative colitis patient or someone with SIBO who is having a lot of restriction around their diet, then I might be prescribing MCT oil, and that's also a really good that works with that as well. You can have your Boswellia with the MCT oil. White willow bark is one of my favorite herbs. It can take a couple of weeks to kick in, so I will often prescribe white willow bark with white willow bark tea, which is delightful in tasting. It is such a lovely tasting bark. I really like it. It's really effective in cartilage and joints, and I might put white willow bark with celery and Boswellia, for example. Celery seed is really great for gout because it works with the body's pH, so it assists with kidney heat reduction as well. So it's an alkalizing herb. Curcumin has rapid response, so I could use that in triage as well. So say, for example, I've had two patients, I've got a sprained ankle, and, my tummy's really upset, I cannot take ibuprofen, what can you do? And I'll prescribe curcumin as well as white willow bark and devil's claw, as well as some of these pain meds that I'll talk about in a minute. And that's just, the impact is really, really quick and tones a lot of that inflammation down. So curcumin for the rapid response. Devil's claw and Jamaican dogwood are a really nice pairing for neuropathy. Devil's claw, of course, is that herb that looks like a gnarled up rheumatoid arthritic joint. So I love the doctrine of signatures when you look at the plant, and it gives you an indicator of what it does in the body. Devil's claw is a really good example of that. Horse chestnut, I use, and butcher's broom with the presence of swelling and a lot of fluid retention. It's shown to be a down regulator of TNFA. So I use it in rheumatoid arthritis and even type 2 diabetes for a lot of that swelling and edema. Corydalis and California poppy are wonderful for pain. Corydalis for torn ligaments and torn muscles, and California poppy is a systemic analgesic. Quercetin and nettle leaf. Do you guys say quercetin? I think you say quercetin, right?
I say quercetin.
Okay, great. Saying it right for a word change. All right.
You say everything else wrong though. No, just
For sure. All right, quercetin, or if you say quercetin, it's that as well. I absolutely love this combo. It's been shown to inhibit TNFA production in macrophages, so well use in triage. Now, what's been interesting, especially with hay fever and, quercetin nettle are quite commonly known for that, but I actually use it now for prescribing for the common cold, because all of the uncomfortable symptoms, as I related earlier, is not because of the virus, it's in the inflammatory response. So rather than use acute anti-infectives or actually use immune stimulators, I'm using triage anti-inflammatory botanicals and getting really good results with that. So quercetin or quercetin and nettle are for that. And the dosage of quercetin would be, I'm using an upward of 600 milligrams every 4 hours, and it just knocks it out. Inflammatory biomarkers, there's plenty of pathology testing for inflammation as wide, but I put this in here so you could kind of get a range to sort of work with. But here's the most common one. So ESR is the erythrocyte sedimentation rate. That's how quickly the red blood cells settle within a test tube. That's quite common, as well as the C-reactive protein. That's a marker that is pretty much standard for what you're looking for in inflammation. It's the most prevalent biomarker. So you're never going to see in clinic anyone over the age of over 10. Usually that's in a hospitalization situation, but I have seen upward of 7 or 8 milligrams per liter. ANA is a diagnostic tool for lupus, a rheumatoid factor. They're both autoimmune detectors, but range for inflammation as well. CBC is going to indicate, acute or chronic infection. But you'll note when you find elevated white blood cells and platelet counts with low hemoglobin, this is a surrogate for inflammation, and that will indicate an immune-driven inflammatory response. It can also be an indicator of cancer, vasculitis, IBS. High blood ferritin can indicate rheumatoid arthritis, hypothyroidism, and inflammatory conditions. Calprotectin is a stool sample. It's less used, but it's also used to diagnose inflammatory bowel disease from non-inflammatory bowel disease. But I tend to make the assumption of, especially as SIBO and SIFO, I get a lot of the breath test questions. If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck. So I will treat it as such. Vitamin D tests, I'm not negating the usefulness of those, but they're not always completely accurate. The vitamin D test indicated acute inflammation. It's historically low in IBD conditions, so you want to supplement with vitamin D. When you look at trauma and diet, environment, and endocrine imbalance, aging, they all impact serum antioxidant levels. So if the antioxidant concentrations become low, then the scavenging capability of the extracellular enzymes is reduced. So antioxidants as a whole have received both positive and negative scientific attention. So I want to bring your attention to the difference between chemical antioxidants and, say, biological antioxidants. An example of chemical antioxidants might be, say, vitamin C or vitamin E. They don't have the capacity to permeate cell membranes readily at all. So you need an inordinate amount to saturate the system in the hopes of gaining uncertain access within the cells. This requires crossing gut, cell membrane, blood-brain barrier, and if not used, they act passively and may interact with your NRF or RS pathways and actually render them quite harmful. They become oxidized in that state. Biological antioxidants, in comparison, like your catalase and your superoxide dismutase, they're already present where they're needed inside the cell, and they're generated automatically, except for glutathione. Glutathione does not generate automatically. But let's have a look at the potency and the difference, right? If you have one molecule of ascorbic acid, that has been reported to absorb 1 free radical. If you have one molecule of superoxide dismutase, it has the capacity to absorb 1 billion free radicals per second. That is a drastic comparison. So when we're looking at using antioxidant, we want to lean into phytochemicals because polyphenols especially have shown profound capacity to behave really similarly to biological antioxidants, and further studies will determine the benefits of long-term use and parameters. Okay, so lean into phytochemicals. They're doing their job. All right, there are numerous inflammatory pathways, but I want to talk about the master regulator, which is the NRF2 pathway. The NF2 pathway, it's a major communicator between KEAP1, which is an anti-tumor response, and ARE, which is the antioxidant response element. The NRF2 pathway communicates, and it induces oxidative or chemical, it's induced by oxidative or chemical stress, and it instigates a cytoprotective response by the body within the cell. It has a natural on and off switch mechanism, and most of the priming agents for that mechanism is facilitated from plants, which is great. This is a game changer for natural therapies. Priming and enhancing this pathway by utilizing phytochemicals, that means that we can take a targeted approach within the cell to address inflammation. So when we have chemical stress in the cell, it disrupts this tethering, right? So by addressing this directly within the cell, this creates a wave of key outcomes beyond just antioxidant capability. Antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, it's detoxifying, it's cytoprotection. These pathways are involved in repair and metabolic correction. An anti-inflammatory mechanism impacts gene expression and signifies communication between NF-kappa B and NRF2 nuclear transcription. So it releases phase 2 protein and antioxidant enzymes. Let's put it a simpler way. This pathway creates an effective backup system for cysteine-based redox regulation provided predominantly by glutathione. Of all the inflammatory pathways, NRF2 is something that in natural therapies, we have potential to make significant impact. Through phytotherapy, we can help optimize safe and effective biological free radical protection. That's massive. That is massive. So we as natural therapy practitioners can really do a lot in this space. So the best primers will be herbal medicines, fungi, and dietary nutrients that have shown to have chemoprotective properties from oral doses in humans. Evidence for a plant-based diet, but not isolated to just vegetarian diets. But we want a nitrate-rich food, so plant forward for sure. Poor NRF2 regulation has been seen in type 2 diabetes, and primers that may help with metabolic syndrome include coenzyme Q10, maitake, lion's mane, porcini, curcumin, resveratrol, zinc, chromium, vitamin D, and reishi. So we want diets rich in Brussels sprouts, broccoli, garlic. These are sulfur, good sulfur containing foods, parsley, cilantro, turmeric, green tea, rosemary, and grapeseed, nitrate-rich foods. When I'm looking to address systemic inflammation, I wanted to present these to you. These are my heavy hitters. And I presented to you in this way because both curcumin and resveratrol have showed to impact inflammation in many pathways. So when somebody comes to you and you go, okay, there's definitely a presence of inflammation, we're not able to determine by looking at someone, it's definitely this pathway that's really dysregulated, or it's this pathway, they're just inflamed. So what we want to do is hit it with everything we've got in every pathway we can handle to have that systemic anti-inflammatory action. There is significant evidence for anti-inflammatory capacity through multiple mechanisms and pathways for bioavailable curcumin. CBD is, research is tripping over itself over CBD. And I wanted to bring this up because it's been shown to have massive capacity to impact inflammatory pathways. And it has fantastic safety ratings because curcumin and resveratrol at higher doses is contraindicated in warfarin and blood thinners, and also medications that are metabolized by that cytochrome P450 enzyme through the liver. So we're restricted. If we're getting a lot of people with inflammation, it's going to have, we're going to have a high degree of patients with cardiovascular disease who are taking multiple medication. Our country is over-medicated. We know this. So we want to have backup plans. If we can't use curcumin in that patient, what else can we use? I use CBD for people where there's a high inflammation, but there's significant cognitive symptoms as well, especially anxiety, related pain, somebody recovering post-surgery. There's also a really good sweeper for that. Resveratrol is a non-flavonoid polyphenol, and it's originally, this phenolic compound was thought to be phytoalexin, but now which is produced by dozens of plants, including Japanese knotweed, which is a beautiful herb. But now we know it's not just the phytoalexin, it has many biochemical compounds, and they've shown to exhibit antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, cardioprotective, anti-aging properties. And ergothioneine, produced solely by bacteria and mushrooms, it's a water-soluble thiol, and it can only be absorbed in the diet because animals and plants cannot synthesize this. Animals and humans cannot synthesize this compound. It's a newer ingredient to consider and shown potent antioxidant and cytoprotective properties, and it's been shown to demonstrate potential for the treatment of preeclampsia, neurodegeneration, cardiovascular, and endothelial muscular pathologies. So let's look at these a little bit closer. There's over 100 clinical trials focused on the role of curcumin in various chronic diseases, diabetes, cancer, autoimmune, cardiovascular, neurological, and psychological diseases. Its mode of action, it is numerous. It impacts multiple molecular targets, but there's strong evidence to support its role in the NRF2 activation. It is contraindicated in larger doses for bile duct obstruction. And again, for antiplatelet and anticoagulant medication. So be mindful with people with cardiovascular disease. According to the Commissioner e-monographs, ranging dosages range from 200 milligrams up to 500 milligrams twice daily, which is quite high, but it is reported to be well tolerated at those doses. Please consider for adjunct therapy for cancer along with reishi. Rheumatic conditions like OA, RA, and ankylosing spondylitis. I consider it in IBS, SIBO, high cholesterol, lupus, AS, Crohn's, especially ulcerative colitis post heal and seal protocol, like I was talking about triage earlier with those beautiful alternating acetylcholine with the silymarin with tremolo, the slippery elm, tremolo, and turkey tail. I use it in anxiety, cognitive decline, ADHD, and mood disorders, which is maybe not something you would consider, but definitely move it forward in your mood disorder protocols. Type 2 diabetes, fibromyalgia for sure. Now, it's well known that bioavailability remains an issue, and delivery mechanisms or standardized curcumin have been studied when they're delivered with bioperine. It increases bioavailability, but more effectively, I'm not going to screw it up, curcuma galactomannan, there we go, fenugreek fiber. It's complex together and then delivered, and it has shown profoundly to increase the bioavailability of curcumin. Dosages, as I said, up to 500 milligrams twice daily has been well received and enhanced absorption, and it has shown to cross the blood-brain barrier. So through efficacy and also significant free curcuminoids observed in lower and single dose administration. Now that's really important. Originally, we thought that curcumin required like weeks and weeks and weeks to work. However, a lot of these studies are saying in animal and human models that even a lower dose, single dose of 200 milligrams with an elimination half-life of 2.5 hours. And so I bumped that up to within my triage protocol for somebody who has sprains or strains or whatever. Administration of CGM in ulcerative colitis showed significant enhanced antioxidant activity and decreased the level of inflammatory mediators and suppressed the expression of inflammatory markers. Here's a really cool slide to sort of show you, I mean, it just attacks all these inflammatory pathways, inflammatory targets modulated by curcumin. So you can see that it will impact the reactive oxygen species in two ways. It blocks the mitochondrial dysfunction. It also can permeate a nucleus or a cell membrane, and it goes up there to impact NF-kappa B, so your prostaglandin synthesis, your cytokine release. So curcumin is one of those broad spectrum anti-inflammatories that we should consider in practice. And another one that works quite similarly is resveratrol. Many studies have reported that resveratrol regulates inflammatory response through a variety of signaling pathways, but that's inhibitory effects are extremely broad and multi-acting. So for example, it's a primer of that NRF2 ARE pathway. It impacts by suppression of COX-1, it impacts arachidonic acid pathway. It is shown to inhibit NF-kappa B pathway, and its inhibitory action of phytoalexin, which is the active bioactive of resveratrol. Not only has it shown to inhibit COX-1, but it's also shown an inhibitory effect on COX-2 for that antioxidant expression, but kind of like NSAIDs, it's not creating gastrointestinal upset, which is really, really great. Here's another little great slide to show you how resveratrol, by inhibiting COX-1, can impact the prostaglandin synthesis and release early up in the chain and later up in the chain. It can inhibit arachidonic acid pathway way up there, but also come back down and try and inhibit the actual release of prostaglandins. Resveratrol can attenuate liver fibrosis, so you want to consider resveratrol with liver injury and liver fibrosis. Resveratrol in studies of Japanese knotweed showed promise treating depression and adrenal cerebral inflammation in animal models. It has shown chemoprotective activity. Now, what's interesting about this is cancer has been associated with an overexpression of COX-2 isoenzymes due to abnormal transcription control. So perhaps of this mechanistic basis, resveratrol should be considered as part of a chemoprotective activity in cancer protocol, along with reishi and shiitake. Basis for broad sweeping systemic anti-inflammatory protocol, and doses between 200 and 1,000 milligrams for up to 3 months are considered safe. Contraindication, again, we're looking at medications broken down by that cytochrome P450 enzymes, as well as blood thinners and anticoagulant medications. Here's another one. You could just look at this for hours. Look at all the impact. Then when we're looking at blocking or inhibition, that's that red sort of T marker that you can see. Look at it all the ways it impacts the NRF2 pathway. It impacts the prostaglandin synthesis. It impacts cytokine release. Resveratrol is doing it all, which is why it rose to the top of my list as part of my systemic anti-inflammatory protocols. Now, when I consider CBD, let's just talk about that for a while. It's cannabidiol from cannabis or hemp. It can be used topically, or it's been shown to be effective internally as well as an extract. The National Cancer Institute currently recognizes medicinal cannabis as an effective treatment for providing relief in symptoms associated with cancer, pain, loss of appetite, nausea, vomiting, and anxiety. Several studies have described CBD as a multi-target molecule acting as an adaptogen and as a modulator in different ways, depending on the type and location of disequilibrium, both in the brain and the body. But we do know that it works on the cannabinoid system and primarily those CB1, CB2 proteins. Effective for acute and chronic inflammation. So you want to consider for patients taking, if you've got a really anxious patient riddled with inflammation and pain, and they're on these anticoagulant blood thinning medications, then perhaps consider CBD and ergothioneine for their treatment protocols. I absolutely love talking about ergothioneine, and I can't learn enough about it, and every time I learn something I realize I don't know anything, right, Journey? Yeah. So mushrooms are the highest dietary source of ergothioneine and a really rich natural source of glutathione, and they're significantly better absorbed by the body when you're consuming them through mushrooms than if you were taking a glutathione supplement or even NAC. That's well known. These porcini, maitake, and lion's mane have consistently high correlating levels of both. Now, button mushrooms, which is not usually known for their high ergothioneine levels, actually have enhanced amounts after the third cropping, which of course is telling you that it's instigated by oxidative stress and adaptive stress. So if you grow mushrooms, click, 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 and it's the third cropping that is the one's got all those beautiful rich ergothioneine and glutathione content. Now, these antioxidants have been tested and show imperviousness to heat, which is a really good news from culinary medicine perspective. So consume, consume, consume mushrooms. Primers, they're known primers of the NRF2 pathway and improve phase 1 and phase 2 hepatoprotective capabilities. They're chemoprotective, anti-inflammatory, and cytoprotective. It's really important to resolve inflammation in the GIT when you're looking at addressing inflammation across the board or looking at presenting symptoms. Somebody might be presenting with just intolerance to food, bloating, gastritis, or low pH, and you really want to make sure that if that has been occurring for longer than say 6 months to a year, then they would have had a chronic low-grade inflammation. By hitting it with anti-inflammatory botanicals and phytochemicals first, then what happens is you get a reduction in some of those symptoms. You actually see a better symptom picture of what's really going on underneath. So several studies show low-grade inflammation in IBS, IBD, SIBO. This isn't a big surprise. Now, it's either developed post-virally or bacterially, or in response to the dietary allergen, because you might have IBD, but you're continuing to ingest, say, gluten or dairy, and you're getting that daily looping of an inflammatory response, which is creating a chronic situation. C-reactive protein levels are commonly elevated with IBS and D patients, and they'll be have significantly higher levels. But what I think is interesting, it's not necessarily correlated with severity of symptoms. And it's not, the high CRP is not correlated with a severity of symptoms in pain or psychological symptoms as well. But what I have noted is when I have IBD, IBS patients and they have quite significant psychological conditions, I'm going to assume when I get their labs done that their iron is low, which makes sense. You have inflammation in the gut, you're just not absorbing the minerals and nutrients at sufficient levels. So low iron, of course, is associated with mood disorders. So that's something to consider. And if you don't bring down a lot of that information and you're supplementing with iron, the chances are they are not going to be able to absorb that effectively. So we're looking at the protection of the gut wall barrier using licorice and meadowsweet, golden seal, slippery elm, shiitake, and tremolo. An anti-inflammatory, particularly gluten, processed sugar, and dairy. We want a low FODMAP diet if there's SIBO. I'm going to go into this a little bit more, but we want a rich antioxidant, nitrate-rich, beautiful seasonal foods, plant forward. These are the herbs I use to help reduce gastrointestinal inflammation. Gastrointestinal inflammation, it is multifactorial. It has both indirect and direct inducers of inflammation, dietary sensitivity, dysbiosis, and low pH. So acidic pH would be considered a direct inducer, but an indirect inducer would be emotion.
Oh, the big one.
Would be a indirect being emotions and stress, elevated stress. And we just think about it, the gut is the second brain after all, you know. So when considering neurocognitive symptoms like low mood and anxiety, we're looking to reduce the GIT inflammation, and that can help tone all that down. Additionally, an inflamed GIT can reduce, the nutrient, especially in the mineral absorption. So chronic iron deficiency may present with depression, menorrhagia, fatigue, and anxiety, but originated with GIT inflammation. So we want to make sure that is addressed first. Polysaccharides from mushrooms have shown a propensity for regulating the gene expression through several pathways. And one is the inhibition of the NF-kappa B to reduce the inflammatory cytokines, and in a similar capacity to resveratrol. So mushrooms, again, are leading the pack here. Meadowsweet is one of my favorite herbs. It's got salicylic glycosides and it's highly mucilaginous. I use it for hyperacidic cases. So you want to consider in conditions where gastric acid, burning, reflux is a problem. Additionally, bile acid diarrhea in Crohn's disease. It's got a beautiful traditional use, and I even use it as a tea. I love meadowsweet. It's lovely. So if you want to put a beautiful tea together, definitely have meadowsweet in there. Gut barrier herbs, we want to make sure that permeability and reduced gastric acid inflammation is in check. So curcumin, chamomile, Bicol skullcap, golden seal, licorice, meadowsweet. Licorice is just such a beautiful herb. We want to, the bioactives consideration are coumarins, flavonoids, and glycyrrhizin. ACTH-like action on the adrenal cortex. It's similar in anti-inflammatory action. I think this is arguable to hydrocortisone, but a lot of traditional use and empirical knowledge states that that's the case. But it's highly mucilaginous, so helps reduce gastric acid secretion. And a 30-day random controlled trial of deglycerized licorice in 50 functional dyspeptic patients observed a significant reduction in symptoms and inflammatory markers. So you can't go past licorice, it's so beautiful. So cerebral inflammation, I really like. Nigella has some interesting research coming up for the thymoquinone. It's shown to be an activator of the A7NA receptor, which is one of the main regulators of inflammation within the brain. So I'm keeping my eye on that. So it may be a consideration for recovery from TBI or traumatic brain injury as a modulator of the inflammatory response. Lion's mane in particular, it's a star within cerebral inflammation for sure, in both neuroprotective and anti-inflammatory capabilities in animal and human models and neuro regenerative prospects. I also use CDC choline for TBIs as well. Clinical studies have maintained the neuroprotective role of lion's mane through several anti-inflammatory pathways, improving cognition and locomotor capabilities. Magnesium threonate is really interesting because it's used as a supplement to prevent inflammation and memory impairment induced by alcohol and drug abuse. So it should be considered for cases of toxic load, drug and alcohol related cognition and inflammation and reduced capacity. So I'll couple that with lion's mane. I'll couple magnesium threonate at about 350 milligrams per day with lion's mane on a regular, definitely 3 to 6 months. Ginkgo biloba shows promise in treating some of the neurological sequelae associated with Alzheimer's, TBI, stroke, normal aging and edema, tinnitus, and macular degeneration. I have been unsuccessful using ginkgo biloba in tinnitus, but some practitioners swear by it. Mechanisms of action may include antioxidant, neurotransmitter receptor modulatory, and antiplatelet activating factor properties. It also helps improve short-term memory. So I use it in conjunction with Bacopa monnieri for short-term and long-term memory. So for people who are studying, especially people who have had mono or any kind of neurological inflammatory viral infection, then I will definitely hit them with some cerebral anti-inflammatories longer term. And there's no safety issue around taking ginkgo biloba for 3 to 6 months at a time. And anyone over the age of 50 who have had a stroke, they're on ginkgo biloba for as long as need be, for as long as you can get them. Now we're just going to finish up with some talk about culinary medicine, because in a world of genetically modified, engineered, poor humane treating animals, antibiotics, steroids, fertilizer, cooking with trans fats, preservatives, chemicals, flavoring, pesticides, it stands to reason that addressing a diet is a primary piece of anti-inflammatory protocol. And I call it culinary medicine because that's what it is. A diet is something we do. Culinary medicine is a treatment. Foods can harm, and I believe that they can heal as well to a certain degree. So that's why we call it culinary medicine. And culinary because it should taste good. It shouldn't just be healthy, it should taste really good. So if any of you are foodies, I do have an Instagram account, Functional Health and Apothecary, and I have quite a lot of food porn in there for those who are really like anti-inflammatory cooking. These are my standard diets. So low FODMAP for SIBO and SIFO, of course, low fructose diet for SIFO especially, and IBD. I prescribe paleo pretty much predominantly than any of the others. You know why? Because it is free of processing. And that seems to be the key thing that is driving a lot of our infection. It's a no processing diet, right? So dairy and low processed sugar or immune-driven inflammation. For immune-driven inflammation, I recommend a high nitrate diet for cardiovascular disease or poor microvascular circulation, neuropathy as well. Gluten-free for Crohn's, IBD, and IBS, of course, and AIP, which is the anti-inflammatory protocol. It's an elimination and reintroduction diet, but they also call it autoimmune paleo because it's free of grains, it's dairy-free, and it's no processed, especially no processed sugar or processed foods. But for the basic standard, you want a plant-forward, organic as much as possible, local, minimum grains, avoid processing altogether as much as possible, especially sugars. We want a significant focus on dietary mushrooms and a variety of dietary mushrooms. There is more than just button mushrooms out there. And if you're lucky enough, like me, to live in the Pacific Northwest on the West Coast, then you are exposed to some of the most amazing mushrooms in the world. So highly recommend you suggest to your patients to go to maybe the farmer's market to explore a few more options. We want organic leafy greens, fresh herbs, a variety of spices. You can do a bit of a deep dive into some Ayurvedic and TCM philosophies around diet, which is so beautiful. Something like eating around your dosha in relation to Ayurveda. There's some beautiful concepts there. So to summarize, by looking to actively treat inflammation through botanical and culinary medicine in the primary stage of patient care, you can often see a reduction in symptom severity, you can see improvement in circulation, you can see cognitive and mood shifts, and you can see improved protocol response time. So that is it for me, and thank you so much for joining. But I know we've just hit 6 o'clock, but if anybody has any questions, I can see a few in the chats there. Joni, if you want to, are they questions? If anybody has any questions, please just put it into the chats and we'll try and address those.
Yeah.
Web again.
Yeah, thank you so much. As usual, you never disappoint.
Great.
Brilliant presentation. When it was asked what your Instagram page was, so I did go ahead and put it in the chat.
Oh, good. There you go. Thank you.
Yeah. And we generally go over an hour, so don't worry about it. If anybody has questions or comments, you're welcome to put it in the chat or just unmute. I've muted everybody, but you can unmute yourself and speak up. And we've got a few here. Ilana wants to know if you could advise the dose of white willow bark tea.
Yeah. I use a tablespoon in about 8, I've got to convert to ounces, one moment. I use about a tablespoon in about 12 ounces of hot water. If you can reduce it to 3/4 of a tablespoon to 1 8-ounce cup of water, and I steep it for about 5 minutes to 10 minutes. Because it is a bark, you really want a longer steeping process, and I recommend 2 cups per day. And I like all my arthritic patients are on a white willow bark tea because it's just so lovely.
I was curious about that with the cartilage and joint problems. And is there any issue with the salicin or salicylic acid and bleeding? Do you have to have any caution about that?
No, because the salicin in white willow bark is not a direct COX-1 or COX-2 inhibitor. They work differently to NSAIDs. Great question, Alana. Yeah, so there's no concern there.
And the other question I have too is about curcumin. I tincture curcumin, the root. I don't see anybody talking about doses for the curcumin tincture. And is there a therapeutic dose, or is it better to take the capsule where it's more bioavailable?
Yeah, that's also a good question. So if you're doing an extract of the turmeric in itself, then it will have different properties and different expression of action. So for curcumin tablets, yes, you definitely want to take one that's bioavailable. Otherwise, you're just wasting so much of it, and the body just cannot absorb it correctly. And we have seen, I'll repeat this, but you also get access to the slides, and I pop that in there. So we have seen, so one dose can be 200 milligrams for, say, something in an acute triage situation. You can go upward of 500 milligrams twice daily, which has been shown to be safe and tolerated really quite well. And I have not used that higher dose because I get efficacy at 800 milligrams. If I've got somebody who's in real like discomfort, I hit it with sort of 800 milligrams and then they can feel it within 24 hours. So
Thank you. Thank you.
yeah.
Amanda, James would like to know what dosing you use for lion's mane.
Yeah, and Joni, I don't have my lion's mane here, but I think it's 350. I can grab it really quickly. One moment.
Great presentation, Joni.
Yeah, it's
I was like taking notes like mad.
I know, me too. I've got my paper here. I'm taking notes, yeah.
Sorry about that, James. Yeah, 1,000 milligrams. So I was looking at 350, sort of 3 caps per day. But at 2 caps, the Real Mushrooms Lion Mane, you're getting 1,000 milligrams of the extract. So on lion's mane, it depends what I'm prescribing it for. For any kind of cognitive impairment, I'll do 2 caps twice daily. So that's up to 2,000 milligrams a day. And that's so well tolerated. But I want impact, especially with somebody with cognitive inflammation. I want to tone that down quick because we only have one brain. And what's different to systemic inflammation is if somebody's got cognitive inflammation, especially from a TBI, I want to bring that down really, really quickly, because it does not, our cells in our brain does not regenerate that quickly, and we do not want to impair function. So I'm up there at least 2000 if I'm looking at a real TBI.
Awesome. So Brian's asking about mushroom blends, the multi-myco capsules versus the single myco. So I think that means, like, you know, the blends, like for instance, the 5 Defender versus, would you like to mix your mushrooms up?
I do. I really like the Real Clarity. Again, because I deal with inflammation, I want to make sure that the brain is taken care of. And because I'll be getting people who are really unwell. So I'll use and of course the ergotheniine is really a combination of a lot of mushrooms. It's just isolated, right? But I use a lot of powders. I like to mix them myself in capsules, especially with the GIT stuff. But the 5 Defenders is fantastic as a concomitant for cancer. If I'm sure that it's an immune driven inducer of inflammation, then I'll go with 5 Defenders. It hits everything right there.
Right. And mushrooms seem to work really well in synergy, supporting each other. This is what feedback we've gotten from other practitioners as well. So Sandhu is asking about mycelium, lion's mane. Is it better for nerve degeneration than the mushroom or the fruiting body?
Okay, so go ahead, Joni.
Yeah, no, that's, you want me to answer that?
Yeah, you got that one. I know you do. I've known you long enough.
Yeah, you know, the mycelium, there's some really compelling studies out there regarding the mycelium for nerve degeneration. There was you know, there's some rat studies, et cetera. The thing about the mycelium, though, is that, you know, it's, you know, I think there's going to be amazing, you know, there's amazing drugs that are going to be coming out, but working with that mycelium, you want to extract it in a liquid broth instead of growing it in that, you know, there's different ways to work with the mycelium. So I guess it depends on what kind of product you're working with. I mean, most of the traditional studies around lion's mane and mushrooms in general have referred to the actual mushroom or
fruiting body, yeah.
Fruiting body, but the fruiting body is the mushroom. But there's more and more studies coming out about the mycelium, and I would say lion's mane in particular has some really interesting mycelium, you know, studies and excitement.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. So, and the fruiting body has shown to be neuroregenerative as well. So yeah. I mean, I use both. I use Host Defense and I use Real Mushrooms, but I tend to lean into the lion's mane because I get results.
Yeah.
I get results from it, from the fruiting body. Absolutely.
And also from the mycelium. I mean, we get people talking about the mycelium products all the time that get wonderful results. So I'm not saying there's not anything to it. I honestly don't know. I know more about the mushroom fruiting body, you know, and I know it works. So, yeah.
Well, all mushrooms are, just to respond to James, all mushrooms are immune, show immunological, beta-glucans and polysaccharides show immunological improvement. So you can't really go wrong. Right. I just want to answer something about the, Sandhu asked about the liver risks. Liver risks with mushrooms. I have not had any kind of hepatotoxicity and I stay within my range. I am not concerned about it. The body breaks down their natural biological biochemicals. So the body recognizes it as such and it breaks down and metabolizes beautifully. And they're NRF2 enhancers or primers. So it works through the liver enzymes anyway, the phase 2 and phase 2 liver detoxification. So they're good for the liver. They're actually hepatoprotective rather than hepatoconcerning.
Yeah. And Sandhu's asking about the Stamous-brand mycelium.
The Host Defense.
The dosing for that, is that similar to ours? Because I don't know. Do you know that?
Yeah, I do. The dosing is very similar depending on what you're presenting with, what symptoms you're looking at. If you're just looking at, you know, supporting somebody who may have systemic inflammation, however, they're having cognitive symptoms, which may not be related, may be related to dysbiosis, then I might bring that dosage down to say 2 caps per day, just to support that communication line. But if, yeah, very similar dosages. Bye, Katya. Lovely to see you.
Yeah, we've got a couple people jumping off, but we still have many people on. I actually had a question for you, Amanda. I was curious. I didn't see you mention chaga at all, which have you used chaga at all in practice? Because
I do.
I do feedback about skin, inflammatory skin conditions healing, and about lowering inflammation in the gut. Yeah.
Right. And I did not bring it up with the GIT anti-inflammatories there, because I lean into other botanicals. And because we only have an hour, maybe next time we can go into different body systems more extensively, but I just had to grab my favorites and go. I actually use chaga more as an adaptogen, a digestive adaptogen, especially if somebody has significant hyperacidity, because what I tend to find is I use it as an alternate for people who have a really big coffee habit, for example, and I'm like, this is going to be significantly better for you. So I use chaga more as in my culinary medicine than I do as a medicinal, to be honest, because I think it has beautiful taste, it has beautiful capacity. So I use it in my cooking a lot. I'm going off brand, but anyway, I make an incredible flatbread, which is made from cassava flour, and then I put chaga in there and shiitake because it tastes amazing. So chaga is very forgiving in cooking. I also use it in my gravies. I use it sprinkled on my chicken if I'm baking it. So chaga has, I did not bring it up, but I use it a lot in cooking.
Oh, good. Well, thank you. I'm glad to hear that, because yeah, it's one of my favorites. Ilana, you're raising your hand. Do you have
one last question? I meant to get back to the meadow sweet you were talking about for hyperacidity. Yeah. Are you using that as a tea or a powdered supplement?
No, I use it as a tea, but you can use it as a powder, but people tend to respond better as in palate wise with the tea. It's a lovely tea, but as a powder, it really is quite, it gets very pasty. And for somebody who has already had that acid reflux, they're really not for it. So I go with the tea, and it just tones everything down. And I might give them slippery elm and tremolo. And again, I was saying this to Joni earlier, I used to use slippery elm on its own all the time. And now I combine it with tremolo every time, because it works on the mucilaginous healing. It works like within the collagen, within the cell. So why would I not want to enrich that? So I will use a meadow sweet tea, and then I will use the slippery elm capsules with the tremolo inside it, and I'll alternate to calm it everything down, put that fire out.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us, Alana.
So it's a great presentation. I just was taking so many notes. I sure appreciate you. And Joni, please give my thanks to Mason also.
Oh, great. That's really great. I hope the information was helpful for you in clinic. That's great.
I actually have a text question that just came in. What dosage do you like for quercetin?
Oh yeah, and I put that up there. It's safe to take up to 1,000 milligrams. And I go there. I absolutely go there. I love it. Especially with, James, I get my tremolo from Real Mushrooms, and I use half a teaspoon per day or twice daily. The quercetin and nettle leaf, when I use it in combo, especially for a heavy hitting, say like colds, common colds, yeah, I'll go up to 1,000, not a problem, and the body can handle it. And I think I said it, and I don't want to get on a soapbox, but I really rarely use immune stimulants now for just the onset of a cold. I do what the science is telling me, which is it's not the virus, it's not the immune system, it's your inflammatory response. So by leaning into that, I'm just like, oh my goodness, isn't that amazing what the body can do when you actually just tone it down? So try it. Anybody getting a cold next? Please try it. Hit it really hard with quercetin and nettle, and then message me. I'll be so excited.
And Rob Silver, actually, Rob, you're welcome to unmic as well if you like. He's asking which form of quercetin, because it's not very bioavailable.
Which form is in isomer? Trans. I use trans resveratrol and trans quercetin. When you say bioavailable, Are you talking about within the gut or within the cell? Because the cell can cross the cell wall. And what I'm finding, sorry, I'm not letting you answer, Rob, and I know you, hi. But to preempt, you know, when we were talking about those chemical antioxidants, how we have to saturate a cell, I find that the quercetin and in science as well, because it can have the capacity to really permeate cells a little bit better than that it's getting in, and I'm getting results from it. So at that dose.
My question had to do with the intestinal absorption of it. And I use quite a bit of it in my work. I use the phytosome format. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. And liposomal
Yeah.
delivery also.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
100%.
It's great. It's a great flavonoid.
Absolutely. It's good to see you, Rob. I've seen you in a few of these talks and on Clubhouse, I think. It's nice to see you. Thanks
You
for
can really see me.
it's good to see you. Thanks for joining us today.
Sure, it was a great talk. Thank you so much.
Thanks for
Yeah.
coming. That's great.
One last, same protocol for COVID as with a cold?
No, different talk. Yeah, much stronger, much bigger things going on. It's not just the inflammatory cascade. I can't even begin to talk about how the body has been changing, and of course we've got all of the different variants coming through. So I'm still yet to confirm a protocol that's the exact same for every single person. I have to treat the person as they're presenting. And in relation to using antivirals, I'm still using antivirals. The short answer is I'm still using antivirals, as well as big anti-inflammatories, of course, but I'm still using the immune stuff as well. And it's changing with everybody I see.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah. Thanks so much,
Well,
everyone.
I think, yeah, I think that's it. Great questions, great presentation.
Thanks for joining.
Amanda, thank you so much for spending time with us and sharing all of your knowledge. This is fantastic. Your PowerPoint is just gorgeous.
Thanks.
And yeah, and so next week, y'all, we've got two roundtables coming up in November. We don't have any in December. We're going to give December off, but next Wednesday we have Rosemary Gladstar.
Oh wow.
So wow, yeah, amazing. She's going to be phenomenal. And then 2 Wednesdays later we have Jeff Chilton. So we're going to have our final roundtable of the year. Will be with Jeff Chilton, Sky Chilton's dad and the founder of NAMX, the North American Medicinal Mushroom Exchange. So yeah, 2 great roundtables coming up. And yeah, again, thank you everybody for coming. And we will